What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And today we're going to be doing a day one recap of the Magic World Championship. We have 7 exciting rounds in the book. We got 3 rounds of limited with 4 rounds of constructed. A little bit different from the normal Pro Tours. We're only going to have 14 rounds before we figure out who is going to be in our top 8 and competing for the prize of being the world champion for 2024, and of course winning a cool $100,000 and having their likeness put on a Magic card is absolutely insane. This event has been awesome so far, and of course we've had a ton of news come out of this event as well, but we're going to be focusing on what happened specifically at the World Championship. But before we get into any of that and we look at the standings and some of the decks that have been performing very well in this tournament so far, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we post mainly content about the Modern and Pioneer format, now delving into Standard, since Standard is going to have a bigger focus on the competitive season, and of course some other longer form videos, then please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. It's a very easy way to support me and my content, and if you'd like to support me even further, I have a link in the description down below going to my Discord server. Go ahead and follow that link over there, and then eventually here in the description as well we'll have a link to the Casual Spikes YouTube channel where me and my co-host Randy film the Casual Spikes podcast, where, you know, we end up talking about a lot of what's going on in the competitive environment as well as what is going on just in Magic in general. And lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Mana Traders. Mana Traders is a monthly subscription service where you can rent cards on Magic Online and then use them to play in various leagues or even challenges as well. And you can rent cards for essentially any format or any way that you like to play Magic. On top of that, they also have their own free tournament series that you can register for. You get 10x the prizes if you have a Mana Traders account, and a lot of the stuff you can end up actually, if you perform well, winning some kind of prize as well as qualifying for their invitational tournament that takes place at the end of every year. So if that interests you, go ahead, follow my link in the description down below, and you'll get 5% off your monthly subscription to Mana Traders. And with all out of the way, let's go ahead, take a look at the standings for Magic Championship, or the World Championship 30. And it's kind of a surprise. You know, we had made our prediction at the beginning, and we'll kind of touch on that as we kind of move towards the end of this video. But currently, the lone undefeated 7-0, 7 for 7, Jean-Emmanuel Depraz, the reigning world champion from last year. And looking poised right now, looks like the deck submission was absolutely perfect. We'll be getting into the decks as we kind of like look through some of these standings and kind of talk about some of these notable players. But Jean-Emmanuel Depraz, the lone undefeated player in the event, followed closely behind by Lucas Duchau, Quinn Tonal, Marcio Carvalho, Ivan Arico, Seth Manfield, Simon Nielsen, and Adam Weiss in the top 8 currently. So some notable players just in this top 8. You know, we know Jean-Emmanuel Depraz is the reigning world champion. Lucas Duchau, I believe, top 8'd Outlaws of Thunder Junction Pro Tour, so performing very well here at 6-1. Marcio Carvalho is basically always gets to the world, like the finals of the World Championship, but can never really close, but sitting at 6-1 right now, looking to kind of flip the script there. Seth Manfield, Simon Nielsen, the 1-2 in the Player of the Year race. Simon Nielsen looking to have a 5-2 record versus Seth Manfield at 6-1. But remember, all Simon Nielsen has to do is make the semifinals of the event, and he locks up Player of the Year no matter what Seth Manfield does. And currently, as it stands right now, you know, we have Simon Nielsen, Seth Manfield here in the top 8. We have Ely Cassis, who is also in that Player of the Year race, sitting at 10th. Definitely not, obviously, doesn't have like the very best breakers compared to someone like Simon Nielsen, but you know, things can definitely change and the winds could blow in Ely's direction for him to make a top 8. Simon doesn't make it, and then who knows, if Seth drops out, Ely could in theory end up stealing it if he ends up winning the World Championship. Willie Adel, Hall of Famer. Alexander Hayne, a Hall of Famer, I believe. Ha Fam is someone that we saw earlier in the tournament, also doing very well. Shuhei Nakamura is another player that is in the Hall of Fame and was also performing very well early on. And we can even just keep going down the list. We have Reed Duke, who also has 15 points. Shota Yasaoka, Javier Dominguez, all like some of the 3 best players in the world. You know, towards the bottom of this like 5-2 group. But nonetheless, you know, some very, very potent Magic players that, again, things kind of go their way. They could end up still being in the top 8. We see Pedro Perini being the lone player with a draw at 4-0 or 4-3-1, I believe would be his record, or their record, I should say. We have going even further, Christopher Barone is another player that is like a name I recognize. Yoshihiko Ikawa, Jim Davis. We have Gregory Orange here. We have Kai Buda, who's sitting at, I believe this would be a 4-3 record. Noah Ma, someone that we saw earlier in the tournament, 4-3 record. So on. I mean, we can just kind of like keep going down the list. Jason Yee also in the Player of the Year race at 12 match points. Very much an uphill battle from here. I think if you're in like kind of this 4-3 range, certainly, you know, if you're sitting at like 3-3-1, you know, I'm not sure exactly. I think the cutoff is 4-4, so I think like a lot of these players like Jesse Hampton aren't going to be in there. We have Sean Goddard is like another name that I can remember. Oh, so on Matt Sperling, ETN. You know, a lot of these players, like, they do not have a chance. I believe that they end up missing the cut. I believe it's anybody that is, you know, has essentially 12 match points or better here. So we have like 57 players, by my estimation, that are going to be playing in the later rounds. So that is kind of what we're looking at here. I want to say probably the players towards the bottom here, you know, at 12 points, it's going to be a very much an uphill battle for them to kind of get back into it and get to the point where, you know, they could be thinking about top 8, maybe a top 16 at the World Championship. I would say probably the cutoff is maybe even like this 15th place here, you know, or rather 25th place, you know, like Javier kind of holding down the back end and basically just kind of hoping to hang on, have some things go their way to end up making into this top 8. So very interesting, as we kind of pointed out, or at least as we had stated in our video kind of with our predictions, our thoughts and things like that. I thought Simon Nielsen would be the one to win the World Championship. Of course, still, you know, definitely in the hunt. You're at 7th place. You're in the top 8 currently as it stands, so as long as nothing changes, you're going to be into the top 8 with a chance to lock up Player of the Year with a win in the semifinals, and of course, winning 2 more puts you as the world champion, and again, puts you in the conversation as one of the best Magic players of at least the last few years, and potentially approaching the argument of best player of all time. We have Seth Manfield, who's kind of anchoring down the 6-1 players, where, you know, he's in 2nd place. He has a chance of stealing it from Simon Nielsen, who has had a fantastic, not only this season, but the last like few seasons, Simon Nielsen has been absolutely on fire. So for Seth Manfield to kind of come in and steal that potentially away from Simon Nielsen, if Simon were to stumble at any point, is absolutely insane. Marcio Carvalho, again, a player that has, you know, made it to the finals of the World Championship, could not close it out, you know, losing to someone like Paulo Vitor Damarosa, losing to, I believe it was like Brian Bronduin as well. You know, just being so close, but yet so far away from actually winning the event. Sitting at 4th place currently in the middle of these, you know, 6-1 players, where again, you know, the tiebreakers here are so close to at least getting into 3rd place. I don't think anyone's catching Lucas. Lucas looks like he has probably the best breakers outside of someone like Simon Nielsen, who has almost a 70% opponent match win rate, which is like absolutely insane to think about, you know, at this point where, you know, you're 5-2 and you have like the best breakers period by literal percentage points. But yeah, like we've seen a lot of these players on camera. We've seen the decks that John Emmanuel Duprat is playing. We've seen what Simon Nielsen has decided to register, and we're going to take a look at some of these players in the top 8 here. Mainly, we're going to be focused on Jean Emmanuel Duprat because he is the undefeated player. We have Marcio Carvalho, I know, is playing a pretty sweet deck. Seth Manfield, Simon Nielsen, all these players in the top 8, and then some of the other players that are pretty close that are kind of in the hunt for that top 8 spot that are playing some pretty interesting decks that we've kind of looked at. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our first place leaders deck choice for the Swiss event. So as we kind of stated in our little prediction show that we had at the start of the week, we thought that Girl Prowess was going to be the most registered deck in the format. And according to the metagame share, it was. There was 20 different players that had registered Girl Prowess, Girl Aggro as their deck of choice. But there was only, of that 20 players, 17 of them didn't have Leyline of Resonance in their main deck. Only 3 of them did, opting for the little bit slower, but definitely more methodical, more likely to play around removal version of the deck than, you know, something like the Leyline of Resonance, where you're playing little cards that are worse on average, but, you know, give you the potential to just win games super early on. And I figured that more players would probably pick it, and it would just in general do better because a lot of people are going to play whatever potential 1-mana removal that they could have for whatever colors they're playing. And at least in Jean's case, he did prove me wrong. In his version, he is playing 4 Leyline of Resonance and then playing 4 Cacophony Scamp. So essentially, with this combo, if you have Leyline of Resonance and you have a Cacophony Scamp on turn 1, on turn 2 you can play like a Turn Inside Out and like a Monstrous Rage. You're going to be able to, you know, put a bunch of power on the Cacophony Scamp. It's going to hit your opponent. You're going to be able to sacrifice it and deal even, you know, more damage. So essentially getting to deal like double damage to your opponent. Of course, Heartfire Hero, not nearly the same, but if you are able to have a way to make it die, where there is 1 Calicel Sword in this deck, you can just essentially do the same thing by throwing it at your opponent and dealing a ton of damage that way. So typically from these decks, we've seen, you know, you want to keep hands that have Leyline, and of course you want like a 1-drop on turn 2. So this Heartfire Hero or Cacophony Scamp, and then just load up on pump spells to kind of kill your opponent. There was an interesting play before we kind of get into some of the specifics of these pump spells. There was a play that Jean did make where he attacked with a Heartfire Hero, turned Inside Out on it, played a Monstrous Rage, and then played another Turn Inside Out, all with a Leyline in play, and actually targeted his opponent's creature with the Turn Inside Out to give it enough power to actually kill his creature, but of course not giving it any toughness either. So then he could trample over for a bunch of damage, the creature then die, and then throw the rest of the damage at his opponent's face to win the game. It was an absolutely insane play where I think it's, you see it and you're like, why didn't I ever think of that? Because there's definitely times where, you know, you think about like, oh, I'm going to use a pump spell on my opponent's creature because, you know, like it's kind of a funny thing to do. But like in this like unintuitive way, you can target your own thing with the spell, with a pump spell, copy it with Leyline of Resonance because you're targeting one of your own creatures, and then target one of your opponent's creatures to then kind of have that scenario play out. And Turn Inside Out is, you know, one of the best ones because it just gives you a ton of power, not any more toughness, so then you're able to just kind of push through even more damage. But, you know, we see here, there's only 15 of these like non-creature spells. Of course, you can count Calicel Sword and the 4 Questing Druid. This is kind of a mix of the grindier Gruul decks with the explosiveness of those Leyline decks. And we see 4 Monstrous Rage, 4 Might of the Meek, 4 Turn Inside Out. Might of the Meek is just amazing with multiple Leylines because it just becomes like 1 mana Ancestral if you have, you know, multiple Leylines in play. And of course, if you have a mouse, it's just going to get even more power. You're going to be able to give a bunch of creatures trample, that sort of thing. Monstrous Rage is an absolute blowout for the fact that it gives a creature +2/+0, and then will give that creature +1/+1 and trample permanently, as long as like that's the, you know, that's the last roll that gets put on it. And then Turn Inside Out, of course, getting to Manifest Dread. This is like a way that even if your Cacophony Scamp doesn't necessarily kill your opponent or something of that nature, you kind of use this defensively to, you know, put it on a creature. You end up trading up, and especially if it's a Heartfire Hero, you end up dealing, say, 7 damage to your opponent and then getting to create 2 2/2s, which means that your opponent has a little bit harder of a time blocking your creatures, so then you can just put pump spells on the one that's unblocked and kill your opponent that way, or potentially find any one of these other creatures to turn face up to then attack your opponent. We also see there's 1 copy of Snakeskin Veil and 2 copies of Overprotect. Overprotect is pretty interesting because it's a 2 mana spell. It's going to give a creature +3/+3 and give it trample, hexproof, and indestructible. So this is a way that you can not only protect your creature, but then actually trample over a blocker as well. And +3/+3 is just huge, especially when you're, you know, getting to copy it. So you're not going to get anything from double trample, double hexproof, double indestructible, but giving +6/+6 is absolutely massive. And again, you're going to be able to kind of punch through and power up your creature to get past that point where now you're going to be able to have it survive a lot of different combat scenarios, combat your opponent potentially having their own pump spells to kind of trade with your creatures. On top of that, too, again, like it has indestructible, so it's not going to die. But, you know, it also kind of helps because around the exile base removal because of giving the creature hexproof. So just a really neat technology for this deck. The sideboard isn't really too insane. You see like Obliterating Bolt, like deal 4 damage to creature or planeswalker if it dies, exile it. More Snakeskin Veil. Manifold Malice is really good. Paw Patch Formation has been the sideboard all-star for a lot of these decks. Urbrask Forge and Torch the Tower. Really interesting too. There has been some games where John has been on camera and has essentially sideboarded out Leyline of Resonance and been just a regular Gruul aggro deck, and again has just been absolutely toasting the competition. I didn't think the Leyline version was going to be good enough. I thought people were going to have enough kind of 1 mana removal and interaction to where the Leyline deck was going to feel more like a gimmick where people were going to play it, but it definitely wasn't going to bring up the numbers. And while technically it hasn't, only having 3 decks versus 17 of maybe a more traditional version of Gruul, obviously the number 1 player in the room currently and the only undefeated is playing 4 Leyline in their deck. Whether that's correct or not, who knows? It's hard to argue when, again, the only person that's 7-0 in the room, 4-0 in standard, is playing Leyline in their deck. So maybe not so much a gimmick, but nonetheless still a very interesting kind of technology and kind of interest in deck building, because there is, almost a third of your deck, or just over a third of your deck is creatures, and the other third is lands, and then you have, just 15 pump spells to utilize with the Leyline of Resonance. So really neat there. And just because we're like right here too, Javier Dominguez is also in the Player of the Year race. I believe he is 4th currently on that list, and of course kind of anchoring down the bottom half of the list that we think can potentially make it. And this is also the deck that Simon Nielsen is playing as well. So we have the Dimir Demons deck where we are essentially, this is crazy. So I believe if we can find the creatures, because it'd be really cool, it actually plays Doomsday Excruciator. So for 6 black mana, you get a 6/6 flying demon that whenever it enters the battlefield of its cast, each player exiles all but the bottom 6 cards of the library face down. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card. All right. So essentially, you're giving yourself a very short clock to try to win the game. You're going to be drawing extra cards. Your opponent's not going to outdraw you. However, the fact that they have 6 cards in their graveyard then means that with a Jace the Perfected Mind, you can mill your opponent. So if you pay life with this, it enters the battlefield with 2 fewer loyalty counters on it. So for 3 mana and 2 life, you have a 3 loyalty planeswalker. For 4 mana, you get a 5 loyalty planeswalker. Doesn't really matter. You use the -X ability where X equals 2, and then target player mills 3 times X, meaning that for X -2, you end up milling your opponent for 6 cards, which is conveniently how many cards they actually have, and then they end up losing the game. The deck is kind of held together by Unholy Annex and Ritual Chamber, where for 3 mana, the one side of the room, you draw a card at the beginning of your end step, and if you control a demon, each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life, otherwise you lose 2 life. So you're going to lose 2 life to draw an extra card at the beginning of your end step. And the other half, you can pay 5 mana to get a 6/6 demon, which is, of course, is going to fulfill part of the Unholy Annex where you get to drain your opponent. Then going even further, you have a lot of these removal spells like Cut Down, Anoint with Affliction, Go for the Throat, and Shoot the Sheriff with 2 Spell Stutter, where you counter a spell unless its controller pays 2 plus an additional 1 for each fairy you control, which I think this is just used as like a counter spell. Like counter it unless they pay 2. A lot of the time they're going to play 2 or be able to pay 2 or whatever the case may be. So then you just kind of, pinch them on mana, because even if they do pay it, maybe they have some other things that they need to do, and it's just not going to be good enough if they have to not pay to not have their spell countered while also trying to continue kind of enacting their game plan. You also have Archfiend of the Dross as another demon that can end games very quickly. Creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. You remove an oil counter from it. If it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Comes into play with 4 counters. It's a 4 mana 6/6 flyer. I mean, you're going to be able to play something like Unholy Annex on turn 3, draw a card, maybe you're going to lose 2 life, then you can play an Archfiend of the Dross, and then you're going to be able to drain your opponent, draw another card, and then just your removal spells, boom, 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 they end up losing 6, you attack them for another 6, and then they end up getting drained for another 2. I mean, that ends up being like 14 points of damage dealt to your opponent, and they're probably not going to live for much longer after that. So this is a really sweet deck. It was definitely brought up. There's 4 Fairy Masterminds in this deck as well, which is another World Championship invitational card. Shout out to Yuta Takahashi here. But nonetheless, definitely a really interesting deck. Like Fairy Mastermind, definitely like the mirrors, where you can just kind of like your opponent draws cards and loses 2 life, but then you get to draw a card off of Fairy Mastermind and not lose the life. So just definitely a very interesting card here. I mean, also has some synergy with Spell Stutterer, Stutter, something like that. But you know, this deck is really sweet, honestly. The fact that, you know, people like Javier and Simon Nielsen, this is the deck that they ended up on, which is pretty interesting to say the least. Just for the fact that the deck feels like it's. I mean, we've seen in Pioneer, we had like the Mono Black Demons where they were playing like Bloodletter of Aclazotz and the Shredder. They're the Unstoppable Shredder, where you're trying to one-shot your opponent. And this, instead of playing that combo, is definitely playing just a very good Demons deck that, you know, can just play very big flyers that are, you know, pretty ahead of rate and end up beating you down, and also having this kind of combo finish to where, you know, I'm going to play this demon and then I'm going to minus my Jace to mill you for a bunch of cards, and then game over. You know, you just don't have a chance of actually winning the game and anything like that. Or, you know, you basically just get put off of a lot of cards, and you make your opponent very sad. So definitely pretty sweet. I am definitely a big fan of this deck. We will look at Marcio Carvalho's, and we'll look at the Seth Manfield's deck for this event, and then we will kind of go and talk about some of our predictions that we had made in our pre-event show, and kind of see where we're at in terms of those predictions for this event. So don't go anywhere. Let's go ahead and take a look at we'll take a look at Marcio Carvalho's deck next. So we actually talked about Golgari Midrange. I thought it was going to be the second most played deck. I just assumed that kind of the metagame that we had seen will kind of translate. And for the most part, it kind of did. It's just Golgari Midrange definitely wasn't as registered as I thought it would be. But Marcio, obviously, I believe 3rd or 4th place in the tournament so far, and is at 6-1. So could definitely not be mad about kind of the results you're getting from this Golgari Midrange deck. So really quickly to kind of go over it, you know, we see things where with like the Dimir Demons deck, we see the Unholy Annex and Archfiend of the Dross. I believe that these decks were already playing Archfiend, but Unholy Annex just seems like kind of the right kind of card to slot in, where you're going to get some card advantage. You're going to be able to drain your opponent, and you know, you can just kind of gum up the ground, make it very hard for your opponent to attack, and then just slowly drain them over time. And even having multiples of these going are going to allow you to draw more cards, get more 6/6 demons, and of course drain your opponent for more life. The removal suite is very efficient, and 4 Go for the Throat, 3 Anoint with Affliction, just 2 mana, exile target creature, obviously destroy target creature. Non-artifact creature isn't going to be super great against the Cacophony Scamps and the like Heartfire heroes, but you know, these are still just very good answers to kind of get ahead of these things before they actually end up blowing you out and getting flung at you for lethal damage. Knowing the Affliction is going to get around it completely just by exiling the creature. And the fact that it's tied to the mana value, where cut down is tied to total power and toughness, this is a lot of the time is going to be more of a it's going to be more of an answer for those cards, for the fact that, you know, you can't alter the mana cost of like a card. So this for 2 mana is just always going to be a clean answer, barring any sort of hexproof effect. The creatures, you know, Tranquil Frillback is a pretty big creature, honestly. 3 mana, 3/3. You can pay green up to 3 times, and you may choose one or more, or you know, you can pay green up to 3 times, and then you can choose that many. Destroy an artifact or enchantment, target player's graveyard gets exiled, and you gain 4 life. So this can just be a good buffer for the aggro decks, where for 4 mana, you gain 4 life. Here's a 3/3. Even getting to exile a player's graveyard, if it ever becomes relevant, which can be against the like the blue-white tempo decks, where a lot of their creatures are kind of tied up in what is in their graveyard, and you can end up just kind of tagging one of those creatures before they're able to get it back, potentially. This just being a 3/3 as well is a pretty big body. Sentinel the Nameless City, this is like a way that you can create map tokens, sacrifice them, potentially grow your creatures even bigger to the point where it's going to be very hard for your opponents to beat them in combat. They're going to need to use removal spells, and you know, if you just have map tokens laying around, then you know, any creature ends up becoming a threat. We see Mosswood Dread Knight has been a staple of these Golgari decks for a long time. Adventure Half, 2 mana, draw a card, lose the life. You know, who cares? 2 mana, 3/2 trample. When it dies, you can cast from your graveyard for its adventure until your next turn, which just makes it a very annoying card to deal with, because if you just have 4 mana lying around, it's going to die, potentially trade with something. You're going to get to draw a card, lose the life, and then put it back into play and have your mana up for your potential removal spells or any other follow-up plays. Glitza Sunslayer is another creature that's impossible to deal with in combat. 3/3 First Strike Death Touch for 3 mana. It deals combat damage to a player. You choose one. You get more card advantage. You can draw a card, lose life. Destroying an enchantment, already great. Remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. You get in against an Archfiend to the draw, so they're going to have to trade with their Archfiend, which sucks because they're trading their 4 mana play for your 3 mana play, and they're not even trading. They're just straight up losing their card. Or Glissa gets a hit in, and your Archfiend in the draw loses 3 oil counters on it. You go to your upkeep, and then you lose the game. That is probably not happening too much, but the fact that we have, you know, some of the other like red enchantments, like red cards in the format, like the Phyrexian Furnace or whatever it is, that ends up making like an X1, you know, for the number of oil counters on it. You can use Glissa to get rid of those oil counters and keep those creatures very small, and then they don't snowball out of control. Caustic Bronco, it draws cards. Sometimes you're going to be able to saddle it and have your opponent lose a bunch of life. Flipping it on Holy Annex definitely sucks because you're going to lose 8 life off of it. But the fact that you just want to kind of keep the cards going and make sure that you have as many cards as you can have access to, so you can have all the answers that you need and slowly just kind of squeeze your grip and tighten it on the game to make sure that your opponent can't come back for it. And of course, we talked about Archfiend extensively in the last deck. This is just a very good, cheap, aggressive creature that's going to be able to fly over a lot of things and then get you some additional value for your removal spells. We have Dreams of Steel and Oil, which I believe that this card is a main deck card, it looks like. So this also really didn't show up in the other deck list, but you know, you choose an artifact or creature from among it, and then you choose an artifact or creature from their graveyard, and you exile the chosen card. So this is a way that you can exile an artifact or a creature from the graveyard while also getting a artifact or a creature card from your opponent's hand, which is really neat there. We see the 4 Restless Cottage, 2 Fountain Port, nothing too crazy like in the mana base. 3 main deck Duress, Choking Miasma. For 3 mana is the give all creatures -2/2, and if it's kicked, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. This can allow you to save like your Caustic Bronco or something like that, or even your Mosswood Dread Knight, and then sweep the board away and make your opponents very sad. We see like Harvester of Misery as well, kind of getting to do the same thing. Liliana the Veil, Nissa Ascendant Animus is actually really sweet, and of course, this is the one Phyrexian card that gets, you know, shown in Phyrexian, but the Jace doesn't get it, which makes no sense. But, you know, nonetheless, obviously 6-1, can't be mad at the deck decision. A lot of cool things going on here, and a lot of stuff that we talked about in our pregame show that make a lot of sense. A lot of the cheap interaction that you get here with the creatures is going to be very important in a format where we kind of expect Gruul to be the most registered deck. And while like some of these cheap creatures like Mosswood Dread Knight can definitely trade up, Caustic Bronco maybe not so much, but the fact that this can kind of give you some card advantage and keep you in a lot of games against some of the other mid-rangey type decks that do want to play kind of a longer game instead of playing this like turn 2 or turn 3 game that we kind of expect from the Gruul aggro deck. But you know, that is Marcio Carvalho's deck. Let's go ahead and shoot over, check out Seth Banfield's deck, and then kind of try to wrap up this day 1 recap. And lastly, we look at our second place in the Player of the Year race. Player in Seth Manfield, holding down the back end of the 6-1s, and we see that he's playing Golgari Ramp. I believe Seth finished 2-1 in the limited portion, so he is 4-0 in standard. And this Golgari Ramp deck is kind of like a, you know, you get to play the essential like Golgari mid-range type deck, but then you're also playing this sort of kind of domain strategy. We see like Up the Beanstalk here is the card where when it enters or you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you draw a card. Typically we see this in domain because a lot of the times their cards are going to be cheaper, but they're going to still have a converted mana cost of 5 or greater, i.e. from something like Leyline Binding, and you're going to get to draw cards from that, and of course getting to kind of ramp up to a point where you're going to be able to cast even bigger spells. But you can do the same thing with Overlord of the Hauntwoods, where its impending cost is 3. You can play a Beanstalk on 2, play an Overlord on 3, create an everywhere token that is going to be every basic land type. It's going to be able to tap for any color of mana, and it's going to ramp you. And again, it's going to draw you cards, which is going to set you up for maybe Harvester of Miseries on turn 4. Getting to play something like Shieldred the Apocalypse, followed up with like a Duress, or play like really any of these other kind of cheap cards while also getting to kind of maintain a little bit of pressure. You're going to have those Hauntwoods coming off of Suspend, potentially having to play more up the Beanstalks. You have Virtue of Persistence. Giving a creature -3/-3 is pretty big. So you're going to give something -3/-3. You're going to gain 2 life. And then things like Cacophony, Scamp, and the Heartfire Hero aren't going to be able to do damage to you because they have -3/-3. So even if it was a 3/3 and it would typically deal 3 damage, not only that, you're going to gain 2 life and it's not going to be able to deal any damage, which is really, really nice here. Outrageous Robbery is like kind of crazy, honestly. So target opponent exiles the top X cards of the library face down. You may look at those and play those cards as long as they remain exiled. If you cast a spell this way, you may spend mana as though remaining a color to cast it. So while you're playing, Overlord of the Hauntwoods and kind of getting your kind of ramp on here, and then you have things like Deathly Cover Up to kind of slow the game down, destroy all creatures, and then go through your opponent's deck. If you decide to collect evidence and take some of their most important cards away, Gix's Command here, where you can just kind of pick creatures back up from your graveyard, put them to your hand, force your opponent to sacrifice creatures, destroy all the small creatures, even put counters on one of your other creatures and give it lifelink until end of turn to kind of push the game a little bit further out of reach, by gaining a ton of life. There's just a lot that you can do with this kind of mid-rangey type deck that gets to play a lot of like the good removal that we talked about. We see like Terra Sunder being, a way to kill an artifact or enchantment, really good. But then you get to kick it, deal with a a non-land permanent instead, allowing you to end up taking out creatures eventually, cut down, go for the throw, and anoint with Affliction, again, like the super cheap removal spells. And then Outrageous Robbery, again, just being a completely insane card where you're hitting your land drops every turn. You have Overlord of the Hauntwoods, you're impending these, attacking with them, whatever. Eventually you just have enough lands in play where if you just cast this, it's essentially like, for X equaling 10, you get to draw 10 cards from your opponent's library and then play, cast spells and play cards or whatever from them as long as they remain exiled. So essentially getting to be like a draw 10 on your opponent's turn. Well, you get to leave up removal for anything else here, which is really, really neat. Overall, like this is probably one of the sweetest decks to come out of this. The fact that you kind of jam a little bit of like the mid-range stuff with some of the big ramp stuff that you can do and some of the payoffs that you get with like up the beanstalk and whatnot, that you end up just having this deck that is going to go maybe not nearly as big as something like a domain deck, but you're going to have a lot more consistent of a mana base. You're going to be able to get to the point where you're going to be drawing a card ideally every turn with up the beanstalk, because again, you can potentially get up to 5 mana with Impending and Overlord on 3 to have 5 mana on turn 4. You have Harvester of Misery, Gix's Command, Deadly Cover Up, things of that nature, and you have double spell potentials as well. So really neat deck. I am honestly really wanting to try out this Golgari ramp deck when the event is all said and done and I'm done being Magic Arena poor. But yeah, those are some of the sweet decks. Those are a look at some of the top 8 decks as well from the players in the Player of the Year race and just some other notable players. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of our predictions and kind of give us a little bit of a wrap up here from what we got going on. So some of the predictions that we kind of had, we expected Gruul Aggro to be the most played deck. Currently, it won't. It is. We'll see kind of the day 2 conversion rates and something that we will kind of bring up going into the day 2 breakdown, and of course going over the top 8 decks for that one. So you definitely don't want to miss that. But we kind of got what we expected from the metagame. Golgari not being as widely represented, but there's definitely a few in the top 8 doing a few different things. So maybe a little bit split in that regard from the Golgari ramp decks to the Golgari mid-range decks. But nonetheless, kind of what we thought was going to happen to the metagame is kind of what happened. The only real big issue that I am now seeing is that the Gruul Aggro deck doesn't feel so much all in on the ley line. And like the ley line build of Gruul from Jean-Emmanuel Duprat has proven that, you know, you're not just doing this and if my opponent has a removal spell, oh well, I guess I lose sometimes. That it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like you can build it in a way where you can maintain some aggressiveness, you can put pressure on your opponent, and then you can win the game. And then, you know, in the sideboarded games, you don't have to be married to the leyline plan. You're already playing the full play set of the, you know, Seek the Beast / Questing Druid card in your deck. So then you are able to play a little bit longer of a game if need be, even if you are like off the rip playing worse cards than something like the traditional Gruul aggro build. But nonetheless, you know, John actually absolutely crushing the tournament and exceeding my expectations on what I would have seen from the leyline deck. Of course, we have a whole nother day of competition, so it remains to be seen. But currently 4-0 in standard, kind of hard to argue against the results here. So overall, kind of wrap up my thoughts on day one. It was so much entertaining. There was so much entertaining moments from the event. These are some of the best players in the world right now playing on the biggest stage of Magic, and they are not disappointing. There's a lot of just these like big brain plays. There's a lot of fireworks in the feature match area. We've had a lot of grindy games taking place, and you know, it's basically, to say that I had high expectations for this is an understatement. This is supposed to be, again, some of the best players in the world playing the best games of Magic, playing a completely new standard format, and it has shattered all of my high expectations. I absolutely love this. I hope that we continue to see this high-level Magic that is being played at the World Championship. Because if some of you remember, in the Pro Tour MH3, you know, when we got to the final day of competition, you know, we saw some very sloppy games in the top 8, and I really hope that we don't get to that point in the World Championship where we get to the top 8. And I know it's very mentally taxing, you know, 14 rounds of high-level Magic, 6 of them being limited, 8 being constructed, and then having to, you know, take a day off, and then probably when you leave the event, go and be with your testing team or whoever you're with, and then go and test out whatever matchup you could be playing in the quarterfinals, and, you know, leave your teammates to kind of figure out the rest of it, is a pretty mentally taxing situation. And then you get to the point where, well, now I gotta go play this game tomorrow, and I gotta be, you know, beyond prepared, and I got to be able to last, you know, 5 rounds. You know, obviously ideally it only goes 3, but you gotta last, you know, five matches, or excuse me, like 5 games in a match. So expect to see more high-level play. The limited format's great. Like, don't just skip the first few hours of coverage to then get to the standard part of the event. Watch the limited rounds. It's amazing. Drafting the set has been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed the limited environment for this set. I think Paul Cheon does a very good job. I think Marshall Sutcliffe also doing a very good job. All the announcers doing a fantastic job on, you know, both parts of the event, you know, and it's always great. You know, keep an eye out for some of the news that could be coming out from the World Championship. Because, I mean, just Friday we had a lot of news from Foundations. We have a lot of what the standard format's going to look like over the next few years, what some of the standard sets that are going to be released, new things about Universes Beyond, whatever, and we'll be covering those in a separate video. But nonetheless, during our coverage of the World Championship, you know, please watch every single round. Both formats are entertaining. All the players are great, and we're only going to see bigger and better fireworks and explosions and matches as we go later into day 2, and of course gear up for the top 8. But that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you would like to see next. Of course, stay tuned as we do a day 2 recap after the events tomorrow, or I guess today rather, when this is going up. So be on the lookout for that. You know, of course, subscribe, all that fun stuff. But that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.